Today, we will be analyzing the Battle of Agincourt, which occurred in 1415 and is part of the Hundred Years' War and also part of the Anglo-French Wars. So the Battle of Agincourt was fought on October 25th, 1415, during the Hundred Years' War. It stands as one of the most famous military victories in medieval European history. In this battle, an exhausted and heavily outnumbered English army led by King Henry V defeated a much larger French force in northern France. Although Agincourt is remembered as a simple triumph of English longbowmen over French knights, the reality was far more complex. The battle reflected major transformations in medieval warfare: the weakness of feudal military culture, the growing importance of discipline and battlefield coordination, and the political instability within the French kingdom as well. Agincourt was not merely a dramatic English victory. It represented the decline of traditional aristocratic warfare and the rise of more organized tactical methods of combat. Terrain, leadership, morale, logistics, and social structure all played crucial roles in determining this outcome. The battle also had enormous political and cultural consequences, strengthening Henry V's claim to the French throne and becoming a lasting symbol of English national identity. So let's begin with the historical background of the conflict. The Battle of Agincourt occurred during the later phases of the Hundred Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, a long conflict between England and France rooted in disputes over territory and dynastic succession. Causes of the conflict. So several issues fueled tensions between the two kingdoms. The English kings possessed lands in France, especially in the Duchy of Aquitaine, but technically owed feudal loyalty to the French crown. Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother's bloodline. After the French King Charles IV died without a male heir. Economic rivalry, particularly over trade and control of Flanders, with the English control over the port of Calais, intensified hostility. By the early 15th century, warfare had resumed after temporary truces. France was politically divided between rival noble factions, mainly the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. At the same time, King Charles VI of France suffered from recurring mental illness, creating instability at the highest level of government. Henry V saw this division as an opportunity. So now we're moving on to Henry V's campaign of 1415. So King Henry's goals were he wanted to revive English claims in France, strengthen his legitimacy back in England, gain military glory through conquest, and pressure France into territorial concessions. Henry framed the invasion as both a lawful dynastic claim and a holy enterprise, giving the campaign religious significance. So the siege of Harfleur. So Henry landed in Normandy in August of 1415 and besieged the port city of Harfleur. Although the English eventually captured the city, the siege proved disastrous. Disease was spreading through the siege camp, especially dysentery, which is very common in the medieval days. Thousands of English soldiers were sick and subsequently perished, and Henry lost a substantial part of his army. After Harfleur, Henry's weakened force attempted to march north toward the English-controlled part of Calais. The French shadowed the English movement and eventually blocked their route near the village of Agincourt. So now we're going to move on to the both militaries respectively. So the English army was estimated to be around 6,000 to 9,000 soldiers. The composition was approximately 70 to 80% longbowmen, so archers, and the remaining troops were men-at-arms fighting mostly on foot. And so the strengths of the English army were the discipline. Henry V maintained strict order and cohesion. English troops were battle-hardened from previous campaigns and accustomed to coordinated tactics. Second was the unified command. Unlike the French nobility, the English army answered directly to one commander, King Henry V. And third was the tactical simplicity. The English strategy was pretty straightforward. They used defensive positioning, longbow volleys, and controlled infantry engagement. The simplicity became a major advantage. So now the French army is estimated to be between about 12,000 and 30,000. Historians to this day still debate the exact numbers. The composition is heavily cavalry, dismounted knights, uh, men at arms, and crossbowmen and infantry. So the weaknesses of the French army is the fragmented leadership. As we discussed earlier, French nobles argued over command and honor. Many aristocrats sought personal glory rather than a coordinated victory against the English. Two was overconfidence. Since the French outnumbered them vastly, the French expected an easy victory against an exhausted and outnumbered enemy. Three was the poor coordination. French forces crowded into a narrow terrain and failed to properly integrate cavalry, infantry, and ranged troops. And next, we're going to move on to the battlefield. So the geography was located between two wooded areas near Agincourt and Tramecourt. The field itself was narrow, recently plowed, and muddy from heavy rain. This terrain would become one of the most decisive factors in the battle. Next is the English tactical positioning. So Henry V positioned his army very carefully. Men at arms occupied the center. Longbowmen stood alongside the flanks. And archers planted sharpened wooden stakes into the ground to stop the cavalry charges. And cavalry is obviously the most powerful tool of the French. And then the woods on both sides compressed the battlefield, preventing the French from fully using their numerical superiority. The muddy field further restricted movement. And okay, next we're going to talk about the English longbow, which has become subsequently very famous from this battle and from this war. So the English longbow became legendary after Agincourt because its effectiveness is often exaggerated in simplistic retellings. So characteristics of the longbow: it's approximately 6 feet long, capable of firing rapidly, and it's very effective at medium to long range. And it also required years of training and physical strength in order to master it. English archers could fire several arrows per minute, creating devastating pressure. However, arrows alone did not magically destroy armored knights. Instead, the longbow's true effectiveness came from disrupting formation, killing horses, creating panic, exhausting advancing troops, and forcing heavily armored men to struggle through mud under constant attack. The battle was won through a combination of arrow fire, terrain fatigue, and close combat, not just arrows alone. So now the French offensive. So first was the cavalry assault. The French initially sent mounted archers instead of sent mounted knights against the English archers. This attack was quickly collapsed because the horses were frightened and wounded by arrows. Mud slowed movement. Wooden stakes disrupted the charges, and congestion prevented the momentum. So the retreating cavalry then crashed back into the advancing French infantry, creating a confusion. Next, the main French advance. So the main body of Frenchmen at arms advanced on foot towards the English center. This became catastrophic. So first was the mud. The soldiers who were wearing heavy armor struggled through the deep mud. Next was the compression. So thousands of soldiers were packed tightly together, and men could barely swing or breathe effectively. Third was the exhaustion. By the time they reached the English lines, many French troops were physically exhausted. And fourth was the constant arrow fire. So even though they didn't penetrate the armor, they caused injuries, reduced visibility, created psychological pressure, and destabilized the French formations. All right, next is the close combat. So when the French finally reached the English line, fighting became brutal and chaotic. English men-at-arms held the center while archers joined melee combat using swords, axes, mallets, and knives. The French front ranks collapsed under pressure, and soldiers behind them continued pushing forward, worsening the crush. The battle became less a noble cavalry engagement and more a massacre caused by terrain and overcrowding. So next is the famous part. This is where Henry V claimed to the fame comes in, if you know what I'm saying. So his leadership qualities, um, he has a lot of personal courage. Henry fought alongside his men and reportedly came close to death during the fighting. Second was his discipline. As we mentioned earlier, he maintained order throughout the campaign, and despite hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Third was his tactical intelligence. Henry chose defensive ground that neutralized French advantages. And fourth was the psychological leadership. So Henry cultivated unity and religious purpose among his troops, and this image would later immortalize him in literature, especially in William Shakespeare's work, Henry V. So on to a very controversial point in the battle. It's the execution of prisoners. So one of the most controversial moments of the battle occurred when Henry ordered the execution of many French prisoners. So why did Henry give the order? So several possible reasons was a fear of renewed French attacks, concerned prisoners might seize weapons, and inability to guard thousands of captives. So this decision to execute the prisoners was well, it shocked the contemporaries because noble prisoners were valuable for ransom, and this moment reveals the brutal realities of medieval warfare beneath ideals of chivalry. So next, why the French lost? So the French defeat resulted from several interconnected factors. First is the terrain, the narrow and muddy field. The second was the tactical failure, as in French commanders failed to coordinate attacks effectively. Third was social structure. So French aristocratic culture emphasized personal honor and knightly prestige over disciplined coordination. Four was English discipline. The English army functioned as a cohesive fighting force rather than competing noble contingents. 5. Fatigue and logistics. So the French underestimated the physical impact of terrain and armor. And then next we have the decline of, this is a result of this battle, the decline of medieval chivalric warfare. So Agincourt symbolizes a broader transformation in European warfare. Traditional medieval ideals celebrated mounted knights, aristocratic heroism, and personal combat, but Agincourt demonstrated that disciplined infantry, ranged troops, defensive tactics, and terrain exploitation could defeat elite cavalry. The battle reflected a long-term military shift already visible at Chartres in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. So Agincourt confirmed that heavily armored feudal cavalry no longer dominated European battlefields. Next was the political consequences. So the immediate effects, the French nobility suffered devastating losses. Many leading nobles were killed or captured, and Henry's prestige soared dramatically. So 5 years later, Henry forced France into the Treaty of Troyes, which was signed in 1420, which recognized Henry as the heir to the French throne, disinherited the Dauphin, which means heir in French, Charles, and united the crowns of England and France through marriage. Although this arrangement later collapsed, Agincourt made it possible. Next is the cultural legacy. So Agincourt became deeply embedded in English national mythology. And as we mentioned earlier, the piece of work, William Shakespeare's Henry V, Shakespeare transformed the battle into a symbol of courage, brotherhood, and patriotic sacrifice for your country. And then the famous St. Crispin's Day speech portrays this battle as a triumph of unity against overwhelming odds. Historically, the speech is fictional, but it shaped popular memory of Agincourt for centuries in England. Next is the historical significance. So Agincourt matters not simply because England won, but because the battle reveals larger historical transformations, which is the weakening of feudal military structures, the growing importance of professional discipline, the decline of knightly dominance, the role of technology and terrain in warfare, the increasing centralization of royal authority. And it was both a military event and a cultural turning point. So, in conclusion, the Battle of Agincourt was far more than an unlikely English victory against superior numbers. It was defining. It was a defining moment in medieval history that exposed the weaknesses of traditional aristocratic warfare and demonstrated the effectiveness of discipline, tactical planning, and battlefield coordination. Henry V's leadership, the English use of terrain and longbow tactics, and the French failures of organization and command combined to create one of the most decisive battles of the Hundred Years' War. Agincourt also symbolized a transition in European warfare as well. The battle showed that heavily armored knights and feudal prestige alone could no longer guarantee victory. Instead, organized infantry, ranged troops, and strategic planning increasingly shaped the future of warfare. Its political consequences altered the course of the Hundred Years' War, while its cultural legacy endured through literature, nationalism, and historical memory. More than 6 centuries later, Agincourt remains one of the clearest examples of how leadership, environment, social structure, and military innovation can determine the fate of nations on the battlefield.